We all know this one. It means shark or danger. But for me, lately, it's meant TED Talk. Okay, how about this one? To Bach and Beethoven, this one meant angel, because it's called an arpeggio, and arpeggio means in the style of the harp, and angels play harps. My name is Zach Tolan. I've taught over 70,000 music lessons and classes. I have written a book series on kids piano. I'm the inventor of a patented music notation system, and I make online music courses. And today, I would like to make 3 promises for you. Promise number 1 is that I'm going to show you what was so special about Beethoven's childhood music education that helped him learn music so well. Promise number 2 is I'm going to show you how music can actually function as a fully fluent language that can tell stories. And then promise number 3 is I'm going to show you how composers like Beethoven, Bach, and Pachelbel all used that language in their music to tell stories. So, let's get started. In the beginning of my days as a teacher, I was fascinated by child prodigies, and I wanted to know if maybe they weren't just geniuses, but there was something special about the way that they were taught. And so I made an important logical leap, and I decided that the best way to figure out how Beethoven became Beethoven wasn't going to be to study everything that Beethoven composed, but instead, it was going to figure out how he studied what he studied. And I would like to compare this to cake. Because when a baker wants to make a cake, they don't take a cake that has already been made. Instead, they have to take a step back and look at the ingredients and find the recipe that made that cake. In the case of Beethoven, it was actually very easy to find the set of ingredients because his very own teacher publishes in 1783 in a music journal, the very first time we ever hear the name of Beethoven, he plays the piano very powerfully. And the main thing he plays is the well-tempered clavier of Sebastian Bach. So all you need to know about the well-tempered clavier is that it's pretty much encyclopedic in its scope. And what I was surprised to find was that it's already considered one of the most important keyboard works in all of Western music history. So that made me wonder, if we know what it is, and so many people have studied it, then why don't we see more little Beethoven cakes just popping up all over the place? And the answer is because for 300 years, the world has been missing the key ingredient that helps Beethoven learn so well. And not just Beethoven, but is actually fundamental to how all of us learn so well. And that key ingredient is story. For music to tell a story, wouldn't it need a language? And that leads me to promise number 2, where I'd like to show you how music actually already has all it needs to function as a fully fluent language. Now, you might be thinking, okay, Zach, but how much of a story could you possibly tell through just sound? To which I'd like to point out that so far, everything I've communicated to you all so far today has been through just sound. In fact, we are so fluent at communicating through sound that we forget that what we're actually doing is using a symbolic system. Now, it's that connection between sound and the nature of human learning that might just have something to do with why the more a student studies instrumental music, the better they tend to perform on almost every other metric. But it's not true that music tells stories just through sound, because we can also tell stories through pictures, numbers, letters, and gestures. Now, when you combine that with sound, you have the 5 main mechanisms that humans use for what we call higher-order thinking. In other words, we are deeply symbolic thinkers. And when we as teachers tap into that, it creates learning outcomes for our students that are more emotionally engaging, interactive, and longer lasting. And that brings me to promise number 3, where I'd like to show you that it's that kind of higher order thinking that composers like Beethoven, Bach, and Pachelbel were using in their compositions to tell stories. We're going to begin with the Pachelbel Canon in D. And when you see these 4 notes, I want you to know that what's happening is an ancient symbol of music that goes back to the 6th century AD. It sounds like this. Now, what Pachelbel is doing with those famous 4 notes is like a musical dot to dot, where he's drawing a line from his head to his chest and shoulder to shoulder to make the sign of the cross. Remember, Pachelbel was writing music in the context of the church. And with these 4 notes, what's happening is we have a line from the 1st to the 4th and the 2nd to the 3rd. Now, I personally had a hard time believing this one when I first read about it. And then I started reading a musician named Albert Schweitzer, who described what he called as a serpent motif. These first few notes sound like this. And that is not the beginning of Beethoven's For Elise. This is the beginning of Bach's Prelude in A minor. Which Beethoven studied as a child. Then I started reading about water motifs. This is the beginning of the Prelude in C, which is the very first piece in the set that Beethoven studied as a child. And when you play another game of musical connect the dots, it makes little waves. And if you move that up just 1 key, it becomes Beethoven's Moonlight Sonata, which is another game of musical connect the dots. And it also makes water motifs. So when Beethoven was writing music, he wasn't just borrowing melodies from the set he studied, he was borrowing imagery. Now, here's where we need to take a pause and divide time, because what we've seen so far has been cross motifs, serpents, and water motifs. And those 3 are well established from the Middle Ages. What's new is what I'm going to show you here. This is measure number 34 of a piece that starts like this. And when I was playing this, I thought, man, it sure sounds like a storm. And I wondered, what if it's not just a storm, but what if it's like the storm? What if it's the flood? And so I thought, if it's the flood, shouldn't it have the boat, like the ark? Well, here's measure number 34. Now, because in the book of Genesis, it's very specific about the dimensions of the ark, I wondered, how many notes are in that measure? Let me compare them for you. The book of Genesis describes the ark with this. It says, so make yourself an ark of wood and make rooms in it and coat it with pitch inside and out. The ark is to be 300 cubits long, so Bach makes it 30 notes long, which is a 1:10 engineering ratio. It's supposed to be 50 cubits wide, so he builds up a 5-note chord, which is a 1:10 engineering ratio. It's supposed to be 30 cubits high, so he makes the highest and lowest keys 15 notes apart, which is a 1:2 engineering scale. He says make a roof for it, leaving below the roof an opening 1 cubit high. Put a door on the side and make lower, middle, and upper decks. And I thought, that's not just music. That is a blueprint. And I thought, what is this? If Bach could do that out of notes, then what else could he possibly do? And the answer so far is not just the ark. It's actually the first 12 chapters of the book of Genesis, verse by verse. And that is what makes this set of music that Beethoven studies as a child more like a musical Rosetta Stone, because it takes an existing language and compares it to a musical language that Bach used to compose. Now, this next example is one that I would have never found if Bach hadn't pointed to it with another type that we use in the language of music, which is numbers. This piece has the super unusual time signature of 24/16, and I have never seen this time signature used in any other music in my entire life. Now, the reason Bach chooses this very unusual time signature is because he's using it to illustrate Proverbs 24:16, starting in measure 16. Proverbs 24:16 says, though a righteous person falls 7 times, they rise again. So the notes that are here in red are to illustrate from Bach's own handwriting where we see the person start to fall 7 times. And the blue is where he rises again. I'm going to be the stick figure person who's falling, and I want you guys to count along with me. Here's number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and then he starts rising again. And he rises again. And that's what's going on inside this set of music. Now, that makes playing music a lot more memorable and a lot more fun. And that is just one example of the power of story in music. But I'd like us now to look again at everybody's favorite wedding song, the Pachelbel Canon. You remember the cross motif from earlier, but now that we have the 24:16 from Proverbs using numbers, let's take a look again using the numbers that Pachelbel gave us right here in the first 4 notes. That was just the cross motif. It is finger numbers 0, then 1, then 2, and 4. Now, that just could be Matthew 1:24. And remember, this is a wedding song, and Matthew 1:24 is where an angel tells Joseph to take Mary as wife. There's a theme emerging. Now, that could totally just be a coincidence, right? But the language of music also has letters, and Pachelbel gives us a violin. So let's see what the very first few letters are that the violin plays. It is F, open E, and D. F-O-E-D is a perfect Latin root for the word covenant, which also was used to describe a marriage covenant. If we take the Latin root foedus, and they're walking through a covenant, not falling and stumbling like before, we can imagine that this stick figure person is maybe the bride, and she's walking down, like maybe walking down an aisle. And is she walking alone? Well, no, not for long, because after the covenant of marriage, Pachelbel gives us another stick figure person who is now walking together as a couple. Follow the motion down, and then imagine that what's going on is they're walking through the downs of life, and then it rises back up through the ups of life, through better or for worse. Now, are you starting to see how there might be a little bit of a story? Let's look again at the serpent. When we played those notes earlier, the first 3 letters just happened to be E, D, and E, which are the first 3 letters from the word Eden. But where's the N? If we draw the next 3 letters, we see a D, E, D. So it goes E, D, E, then the letter N. But after that, he falls. And where does it fall from? C-A-E are the first 3 letters of the Latin word for heavens. This is the word Caeli. And if we're imaginative, we can imagine that the stick on the blue is like a lowercase l, and the little dots next to the bigger dots are how we dot the letter I. C-A-E-L-I is perfect Latin for Caeli. This passage that Beethoven studied as a child is the Eden serpent falling from the heavens. And Beethoven uses both the Eden serpent and the heavens in For Elise. And when he does, he's not just borrowing melodies, he's borrowing vocabulary. Want to see how Beethoven writes his own name? Here in Moonlight Sonata, the red, the purple, and the green are 3 different ways that he uses the letters B-E or B-E-E to spell the first 3 letters of his own name, which happens almost 50 times just in the first movement. Do you want to see how he writes his name in For Elise? Here, he writes it grouped in 3 syllables, like Beethoven. And then, after a space, because Bach also uses spaces between the words to group words just like we do in English, we see the first 2 letters of the name Elise. E-E-E-L-I-S-E Elise in 2 syllables after a space represents her name. And Beethoven has us do this in a particular way that is unnecessary musically, where we play the first 2 with the right hand, then the next 2 with the left hand, in a gesture that makes it feel like they're holding hands. Then, in a sudden switch, he makes us play these 2 little notes. With the left hand, the right hand, and then the left hand again, which is a symbol from the Middle Ages that has symbolized the sound a human voice makes when they're crying. So it's a symbol of sadness. Listen again. Can you kind of hear it? I'll end with this. I was showing this to a friend of mine one day, whose students are in my program, and I said, dude, this is going to seem weird, but I know this is a symbol of sadness, but when I play it, I also feel like I'm wiping tears off the keys. And he said, dude, that's not weird. That's sign language for crying. And he goes like this. And I thought, what? Beethoven went deaf. And when the world's most famous musician lost his hearing, he didn't crumble. Instead, he embraced that uncertainty and started using the sign language he learned because of his deafness to start adding new kinds of vocabulary that can tell new kinds of stories. And through that experience, he gave us the world's most famous musical motif. But the story that he writes in For Elise is a story for another day. Thank you.